Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Chapter 7 of Aristotle's Categories is devoted to quite a lot of discussion of one very important category, which we translate as relation. In the Greek, it's pros t, and pros is a pronoun, which signifies, and t, of course, is sort of an indeterminate thing. It's in relation to whatever. So I am, looking at this book. The looking is in relation to this book. Or if I am in the position of lecturer right now, and you're in the position of audience and lecturer are what we call correlative terms. So if you say the audience, you can say, well, the audience of what, right? The audience of a show, the audience of a podcast, the audience of a video, the audience of some guy getting up on the proverbial soapbox in the middle of town and ranting and raving. Each one of those is a term that would be in relation to the audience, and the audience would also be in relation to that term. Those are what we call correlatives, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. First, we want to think about, well, what does it mean to actually talk about something as being a relative, and we could talk in terms of relative terms, that is, linguistic units that are signifying something relative, or we can think of something being relative, its very being, what it is for it to be what it is, being relative. And Aristotle characterizes this early on, and really consistently throughout this entire chapter in two complementary ways. So the one is talking about being of another. And so it's what we call the genitive case. We don't really have this in English. The closest thing that we would say is the possessive case, and we use that we signify that with the apostrophe s. So-and-so's father, right? That would be along those sort of lines. But to be of another, to be from another, to derive from another, the team's mascot, right? The mascot is the mascot of a team, and presumably sometime way back in the team's antiquity, somebody decided that it would be the Bulldogs rather than the Bullets, rather than the Bombers, right? So that's one way of thinking about this of relation that we talk about in terms of the genitive case in Greek. Heteru enai, to be of another, to be from another, to be in relation to another. Then we have something what we could call, more strictly speaking, being in relation to another, pros heteron. Heteron is just, something else, right, or another. And we have that pros there. So Aristotle is saying it's not always going to be signified in exactly the same way. We have to do a little bit of mental analysis from time to time in order to pick out relative terms. And it's important to be able to recognize relative terms and not to mix them up with other things, other categories like that of substance or that of quantity or that of quality, because when we do that, we wind up in all sorts of metaphysical and logical predicaments and confusions. So it's important to get this down. Now, I want to bring up a few points that will be discussed at greater length in some other videos. Aristotle talks about all relatives by their very nature having correlatives, that is, things that are in relation to them. This is unavoidable because you can't really have a relative term without having a correlative. And when we look at some of the relative terms, we'll see why this is the case. Not all relative terms have contraries. Some of them do. Aristotle uses an example here that's probably going to be a bit confusing, namely that of virtue and vice, in part because virtue and vice are also going to get talked about in the category of quality. Here he's thinking about them in terms of habit as habit. And we'll get to that in a moment. Some admit of degrees. So if we use, for example, greater or same or similar, you can say that two things are more similar to each other than they are to something else, or that they're less similar. So for example, I go back to my frequent use of chalk. These three pieces of chalk are more similar to each other than this piece of chalk. Why? Because these pieces of chalk are actually longer, and this one's been used quite a bit for writing, so it's a little bit shorter. And it also has some rounded edges, too. Now, that said, these two pieces of chalk are more similar to each other than this shorter piece of chalk is. That one would actually be more similar to this piece of chalk here. You get the idea. We can speak in terms of degrees of a more and less. We can do this with other things as well, but this doesn't work for every single relative term. Neither does contraries work for every single relative term, but all of them will indeed have correlatives. So now let's look at some of the examples that Aristotle is going to use. So double, right? Why is double a relative term? Well, double of what, right? You could say, that this is a double piece of chalk. That's a weird way of talking about it. It's probably stricter, or more rigorous to say there are two pieces of chalk here. Perhaps they actually came from a single piece that I broke. And I can say, well, I doubled it. I doubled the amount of chalk pieces, but I didn't actually double the amount of chalk. So we see that this is a term that requires us to relate it to something else. Double of what? This tie, if I fold it double now, there's twice as many fabric pieces, right? We could go on and on and on with examples of that, any sort of number term along those lines. Now notice that term is not quantity, where you might expect to see it for Aristotle, but rather in relation. Why? Because Aristotle is picking out, the feature of that, which is that it exists in relation to something else. Greater or lesser. These terms that we use to signify, again, things that look like quantity, but are really more a matter of requiring a reference to something else, are a matter of, they fall into the category of relation. So greater, right? Greater than what? This is where, interestingly, we run into problems. If we talk about bigger and smaller, right? A hill is bigger than a human being, but much smaller than a continent, right? You can only specify these terms by bringing up something else. Same or similar, or anything else along those lines, like dissimilar, unlike, like. Those require a reference to what the thing is actually like. A great example of this, if we get away from visual examples, think about describing tastes. Notoriously difficult to do, quite subjective, and as we're finding out, some of it's kind of made up on the fly, right? You swig some wine and you say, oh, I taste oak and leather and the cologne that my friend's parent used to wear back in 1986. So that's getting very subjective, right? But you get the idea. If you're saying that it's like those sorts of things, then you have to specify. You can't just say, well, it's like, and then just leave, dot, dot, dot after that, because it's not like anything then, right? If you think about other flavor profiles, like great example. When I was a kid, we had a bubblegum explosion. At first, there was just bubblegum, and it was bubblegum flavored. I don't even know what bubblegum flavor really is. Just kind of sugary, and I'm sure there's some fruit flavor that's in there, mixed in there somewhere. And then suddenly, Bubble Yum and Hubba Bubba came out, and they had grape flavor and orange flavor, and some things that weren't quite so good, like chocolate flavor. And on and on and on and on and on, right? So if you want to say, when you're saying those flavor things, you're saying it tastes like this. If it's watermelon flavored gum, it is gum that has the same taste as ... watermelon, right? And oftentimes, it's interesting because there can be kind of a reversal where people who are so used to artificial flavors get used to the artificial flavors, and they use that as the primary point of reference in the relation, and they taste a watermelon, and they're like, this doesn't taste the way a watermelon should. And you're like, buddy, that's the watermelon right there. The gum you've been chewing, or the Slurpees or whatever you're used to, are not the actual thing that this is related to, derived from. Similarly with orange or root beer or anything along those lines. So those are all fairly straightforward. Then he brings up an example that he uses quite a lot, and there's a lot to be said about Aristotle and slavery. We don't need to go into that right now, but he's going to use that as an example of a term. You don't get a slave without also having a master. And if the word slave is throwing you, think servant and employer, or something along those lines, right? Parent is not a term that he uses, but he uses this in other places. Great example. You cannot be a parent without there being some sort of child whom you are in relation to, right? You see people posting these things to be clever or cute, when they're giving their profile. I am the parent of this person, right? So they define themselves as, Susie or Tommy's father, or so-and-so's husband, or so-and-so's wife, or mother, or grandmother, or whatever, right? Those are relational terms. All of those are in relation to each other. So those provide us with some great examples. Now, Aristotle brings up another set of relational terms that are a little bit trickier for us to wrap our heads around. Habit and disposition, which he's actually going to discuss under the category of quality, the toposon, which is in the next chapter. Here he's discussing it, but he's not discussing it in terms just of habit, which is hexes, or disposition, diatheses, per se. He's thinking about that of relation, the habit of, right? So if I have a virtue like the habit of generosity, eleutheria in Greek, also translated as liberality or freedom, then I have a habit, and the habit is specified in relation to certain things. Habit is a habit of behaving and feeling certain ways. Knowledge, right? Knowledge is of something. So if I know Aristotle, meaning I understand Aristotle's texts and what's being talked about in them, I don't just have knowledge per se, I have knowledge of this thing. If I know how to unclog a drain, very, very rudimentary level plumbing, that is knowledge not of Aristotle's text, but of unclogging drains, or perhaps of pipes, if we want to say it that way. Perception, similarly. You're seeing this green book. Hopefully you're not red-green colorblind, in which case I don't know what color you're seeing there, but it's not what I'm seeing. Both of us are seeing this book. Perception of the object, the color, the thing that is being experienced. If I taste the book, it doesn't taste like anything really. No real flavor profile there. Chalk, I remember tasting that as a kid. Not a good thing to taste. Definitely chalky, right? Perception of something. Position. Here the term that he's using is thesis, meaning where something is being set, or the act of setting something. And there is a category of position or condition, or however we want to translate it. In that case, it's not exactly the same term. It's kaesthai, which is from that same word. That's the sort of passive verbal form of the verb for putting things in place. There's a little bit of strangeness about the Greek language in this that we don't really need to worry about here. But he does want to say, look, standing, sitting, all those sorts of things, those are being positioned in a certain way. But position itself is, in a certain respect, a matter of relation. Setting this here, right? So those are all examples, and you see just how much scope this category of relation has. The last thing that I need to mention, and I'll do another video discussing this in greater detail, is that no substances or parts of substances are relations or relative terms according to Aristotle. This is a very important point. The relationship between, say, teacher and student, where you can't have a teacher without a student, or you can't have a student without a teacher, is not the same thing as the relationship between hand or head, to use the examples that Aristotle brings up, and the substance, human being. Aristotle gives you some explanation of this. Basically, what it comes down to, what we'll say at this point, is that the thing is a substance, and it's not being defined as hand just in relation to me. It doesn't exist as a hand only in relation to me. Now, of course, if you cut off the hand, it's no longer acting as a hand, as an organ of this body. It'll die, it'll turn into stuff. But it still remains hand if we ask about, well, what is it? What is this thing? What is it for it to be what it is? Hand is essential to it, or part of its substance. And, now the hand, of course, can be in relation to other things. I can put my hand into my pocket. That's really more of a matter of position, though, or actually even like, it's more similar to is armed, is shod, than it is relation. The hand, of course, can be involved in perception, in which case we're not considering it so much as hand, but considering it as the organ of touch. So all of these are things to keep in mind as we look at the category of relation in Chapter 7.